The neocortex for a human, your neocortex, is often likened to a folded sheet about the size of a dinner napkin. Now, it's not, it's planar from a topologist point of view, but it certainly isn't flat, even if you tried to flatten it out. It has been studied probably more than any other portion of the brain, possibly because people think that it's one of the things that distinguish us from other mammals. But one of the things that was early on discovered is that it has a very regular structure throughout, both in a hierarchical sense, but also in terms of there being modular components. And these were first identified at the anatomical level by Vernon Mountcastle and some of his colleagues back in the 90s. And they referred to these as cortical columns. And in fact, they invented a whole slew of columnar-type structures. If you look at the cortex from the side, you'll see that it's striated in a number of levels. And those levels have been identified, and there's different types of cells that are in each of the levels. The circuitry for those cells has been mapped out in some detail, and not only does it have a well-defined sort of structure with sort of a sheet, a laminar sheet on the top, which corresponds to a lot of connections. It's myelinated. It's the white matter that you see on the top, and another sheet at the bottom, which has additional connections. And in between, there are these columnar structures. And I'm going to almost treat them as cartoons. And there's some controversy about whether or not the columnar structures are real in any sense. But certainly, they are real in the sense that anatomists can pick them out by using various kinds of stains. So my cartoon picture of the cortex is what's shown in the lower right, a set of columns arranged on a sheet with a lot of connectivity, both bottom and top. Various areas of the cortex, specifically those having to do with the visual cortex, have different areas, and those areas actually have mappings that map from the periphery of the body, say from the retina, back to the earliest processing areas, and then mapping from those to other processing areas. And each one of the maps basically preserves a lot of the spatial characteristics of the original signals. So if they correspond to the retina, then the patterns on the retina, points on the retina, cells on the retina that are close to one another, are close to one another in area V1, the first area, visual area, V2, V4, inferotemporal cortex, et cetera. They map through the cortex in that fashion. Don't ask me where V3 is. It's just, it's not a mistake. V3 just wasn't interesting enough to have a number, I guess. The processing that goes on between these areas tends to have both a bottom-up component where data propagates up through the layers. And so I often depict it as a stack, but obviously it's not represented, it isn't instantiated as a stack on the cortex. It's a bunch of plates that are connected together. What got me interested in this in the first place was a colleague at Brown, David Mumford, and one of his students, now a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon, developed a very simple, elegant model of processing in the visual or striate cortex. And the idea was that data came in from the periphery of the body, either the data itself or some proxy or summary of the data was propagated up through the various levels, and that constituted the bottom-up component. And the top-down component was in terms of expectations that were generated by the data that's seen in the first place. And so the data often was incomplete, and the top-down component, the expectations in terms of prior distributions, allowed you to fill in portions of the data that weren't there. And the idea is that these are the kinds of things that enable you to hallucinate or to fill in the details where perhaps the data is occluded in the case of vision or elided in the case of text. So their model was something called a hierarchical model. It was what's called a generative Bayesian model, which is a whole school of statistical inference due to a fellow named Ulf Grenander. The particular way that they modeled the generative models was in terms of something called a Markov random field, but that's essentially a detail. And we'll talk a little bit more about various kinds of instantiations in terms of what are generally called graphical models, Markov random fields being a particular case. So again, in the spirit of using cartoons in order to sort of understand the high-level concepts, I want to start with a very simple pattern recognition problem, and I want to use that in order to motivate the use of generative models. So suppose that we have the task of recognizing or distinguishing between different kinds of buildings, and we only have two different buildings. We have garages, which I'm going to tell you in this cartoon world consist of usually one-story building with a shed roof, and houses, which are usually two-story buildings, though sometimes they're one-story buildings, and they tend to have gabled roofs. We're going to divide the visual field up into 4 quadrants, and those are usually termed receptive fields. And the idea of a receptive field was first introduced by Hubel and Wiesel, where the idea is that there are portions, little areas on the retina that map back to cells, and those cells are tuned to various patterns. So in our cartoon here, the 4 receptive fields are tuned to a number of different features, and they can recognize a left pitch of a gabled roof, or the left pitch that corresponds to one portion of a shed roof, a right pitch, a left 2-story building, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a hierarchical model. It's a generative model. It happens to be also called a Bayesian network. And each of the boxes corresponds to a random variable. The random variables are indicated as building, roof, frame, and then more and more detail as you go down through the hierarchy. The random variable building can take on 3 possible values: house, garage, none, etc. And you can see that the variables high in the hierarchy essentially consist of a composition of the features that are at the next level down. So what we want to do, this in a sense basically outlines the structure of the model. We also want to instantiate it and provide a set of parameters that allow us to make quantitative distinctions as well as qualitative distinctions. So to add to the graphical structure of the model, we're going to establish a set of parameters. And for each of the random variables, we'll give a conditional or marginal distribution. The conditional distribution is in the case of variables that have parents, and for variables that don't have parents, it's a simple marginal. So the probability of building, that's our prior on whether or not we're going to see a building in the visual field. And the prior on the probability of roof given building is just a conditional probability that says if, in fact, we've seen a building, then what's the probability that we're going to see different kinds of roof structures? One of the reasons that these models are used so much in statistics and computer science and artificial intelligence nowadays is that they have a solid semantics. So with those distributions, the distributions on the previous page, we can completely describe the corresponding distribution. And statisticians like that because it's the It's the coin of the realm in statistics. So what we want to be able to do is to describe a joint distribution, and that's what the variables on the previous page allow us to do. But we're usually not interested specifically in the joint. We're interested in marginalizing out some of the variables and getting probabilities with respect to particular variables. So there's a process of inference whereby you can compute the marginal given some evidence. And if the evidence is empty, then you're still going to compute a marginal. And this gives an indication of what you would compute for a particular instantiation of the parameters on the previous page. So in this case, what I've done essentially is run an inference algorithm. I gave it some initial parameters. For example, I said that the probability of a priori seeing a house is about half, of seeing a garage is about a third, and seeing nothing at all is about a fifth of the time. So running the inference algorithm, because of some subtleties in the way that things propagate, the distribution that results is not exactly that distribution. And here's what you would get in what's called the belief function for the case of the graphical model where there's no evidence. And again, it indicates that, yeah, pretty much half the time you see a house. And if you look at the upper left corner, it says most of the time you're going to see a left pitch, which is consistent with the idea that we're looking at a house. Okay, anybody having trouble with understanding the basics of these models? Okay, so now we can add some evidence. And here we're going to fill in the evidence for 3 of the quadrants and leave the other one to float. So the little boxes shown in red correspond to the instantiations of those random variables. And as a consequence of that, the data sort of percolates up. And we see that the probability of there being a house is much higher. But the priors and the expectations also propagate down. And you see it's a much higher probability of there being a left pitch. Okay? So this is an example of both the bottom-up and the top-down inference that these graphical models are capable of. And it also gives you an example of a kind of pattern recognition or pattern completion where shown a portion of the pattern, it fills in the other portions of the pattern. There's a lot of tricks that are required to make it more useful. And in particular, one of the most difficult problems in machine vision, or for that matter in machine translation, is deal with various kinds of invariants, and in particular translation and scale invariants. There's also compositionality constraints. So if we were to take the generative model on the previous page and do what's often done as an example of a generative model is you fix the top variable, so you set it to be building, and then you sample from the distribution, that is, you sample at the leaves, and the question is, what kinds of images would appear? And if you did, for that particular model, you get things that's shown like that. So the pieces might be right, at least statistically, but obviously they don't cohere in any interesting way. So somehow you have to add compositionality constraints. You also might want to look at problems where there are multiple instances of the same object in the image. In particular, you'd often see a house with a garage adjoining, and you'd like to be able to recognize that as well. In order to do that, you have to construct a more complicated model, and it's done primarily by adding additional dependencies and correlations between the random variables, but the basic structure essentially stays the same. So we're talking about the cortex, not about graphs that you can draw on blackboards. And the kind of connectivity in the cortex is of a relatively benign sort. So they're on the order of 10 to the 11th neurons, but only 10 to the 15th connections. So this is usually referred to as a very sparse graph. It has what's called the small world properties. Essentially, the distance between any 2 nodes, any 2 neurons in the graph is relatively short because there's a blend of short-range connections and long-range connections. This kind of connectivity is rapidly becoming possible to model on cluster computers, and that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about in the remainder of the talk. So another aspect, besides the ones I just mentioned, having to do with the compositionality constraints and dealing with scale and translation invariance, is that really what the cortex is good at doing is fusing data from multiple sources, handling multiple modalities. It also allows us, basically the cortex is a sequence machine. It's used to recognize sequences more than anything else, whether those sequences arise acoustically, visually, or otherwise. So we have large pipes coming in corresponding to data, and we'd like to determine correlations between that data. We'd like to be able to recall an image based upon some sound, recall a sound based or a song based upon an image, etc. And exactly how we structure this is critical and one of the goals that we have in this project. So at this point, I'm going to give you another cartoon. And this cartoon essentially is an example of the kind of hints that engineers can get from looking at the cortex, and one of the ideas that drove the models that you'll see in just a minute. So this is the primary visual pathways back from the retina to the striate or visual cortex, and as you can see that the left side of the brain gets information from both the left and the right eye. It's the left side of each of those two eyes, but nevertheless, it's getting information from both. It gets mapped back to the lateral geniculate. You can sort of think of the lateral geniculate, and if there are any neuroscientists in the audience, they'd probably object to this, but you can sort of think of the lateral geniculate as a kind of image buffer. Though there's a good deal of processing that happens not just at the lateral geniculate, but even earlier, actually on the retina. From a computational point of view, the people who the people who try to elicit and understand the circuitry of the brain have mapped it into various components that perform operations on images, or images and the mappings from images through various processing things. So the retina maps back to the lateral geniculate, which maps all the way back to the back of the brain in the striate cortex, and then it branches out to several other areas in area 2 and the medial temporal cortex. The notion of a visual field is most often associated with the areas of the retina and as they map back onto cells. So on the far left, the green nodes are supposed to correspond to rods and cones. They map back to what are called bipolar cells, and they back to retinal ganglion cells. And at each point, you can see that cells are taking in information from cells in the layer in front of them. And as you get further and further back from the periphery of the body, the cells essentially are agglomerating data from a much larger section of the retina. So the visual field, as it were, you can either think of it as the set of cells in the layer closer to the periphery, or you can think of it as mapped all the way back onto the original visual field at the periphery of the body. And as you move further and further along the visual pathways, the cells are capturing larger and larger portions of the overall visual field. That is, they're computing features of the images that constitute a much larger visual field. The cells, especially in the lateral geniculate, many of them are referred to as simple cells. They're anything but simple. And those cells are said to be simple because it can often be likened to computing something like a difference of Gaussians, where essentially the regions of the visual field, so each one of the square boxes on the left corresponds to an image of the visual field, and then the isolines essentially are meant to be the third dimension, indicating the amount of intensity or the response of the cells in that portion of the eye. And so basically, for simple cells, the receptive field maps into portions that are always in one, performing one type of computation, either doing a difference or enhancing the data that they have, or just the opposite, reducing the intensity of the data that they see. Complex cells are different for a number of reasons, but the most fundamental one is that whereas in a simple cell, the type of phenomena that it responds to is typically centered. It has one orientation, it has one position in the visual field. In complex cells, they respond to that same sort of phenomena no matter where it appears in the visual field. So for example, in simple cells that what are called center surround cells, the one that we showed in the top on the previous slide, essentially what they do is they're looking for a high intensity dot surrounded by low intensity cells. You can, a generalization of that is that you can respond to a bar of light or a bar of dark surrounded by sheets of white on either side. So in a simple cell, the bar may be at a particular orientation, but it's always centered in the visual field. In a complex cell, the bar can be positioned anywhere in the visual field. So obviously, complex cells are able to handle a much more complicated kind of inference, and in particular, they are able to essentially respond invariant to the position of the type of phenomena that you're looking for, the position in the visual field. And there are a lot of them. In fact, most of the cells beyond the striate cortex are of this sort. So now we have the data moving back to, again, back to the picture that we started off with. The information that is computed in the visual field, in visual area 1, is essentially orientation information. So it's determining the orientation of little bars in the image field, or half planes in the image field. And you get both information from the left visual field and the right visual field. And in this case, I'm asking the question, given that there are cells that respond to these things, and some are coming from the left and the right, how might they be organized on the surface of area V1? You could imagine a checkerboard. You could imagine slices as shown in the middle, or you could imagine some other topology. In fact, given that it's called the striate cortex, you might guess that it's the one in the middle. And indeed, that's exactly how the striate cortex is organized, with bands corresponding to the left visual field and bands corresponding to the right visual field interspersed. And then within each one of those bands, they're cut up in terms of cells that are tuned to specific orientations. So the box on the bottom essentially is what's called a hypercolumn. It's an anatomically distinct portion of the brain. And what it's actually doing, apart from the left and right portions, it's computing, its output indicates one of those cells is basically going to light up and say that there's a bar in that particular portion of the visual field, and its orientation is one of those increments from 0 to 180 degrees in 10-degree variations. So that's a unit in some sense. It's anatomically distinct, and you can also think that it's obviously computationally distinct. That's essentially the level that we're going to be using as a random variable in the models that we're looking at. And it's well enough studied and well enough understood that even though it's a noisy characterization of the angle of bars that are positioned on the visual cortex, it's a pretty good abstraction to use. So that's the cartoon. Oh, and this actually is the black visual field up in the upper left-hand corner corresponds to an image that was shown to a monkey that was otherwise paralyzed, and it was only allowed to see out of one side of its visual field. And they then took the poor monkey, injected a dye in it, and then basically killed the monkey and took a look at the resulting portions of the striate cortex. And you can see the pattern distinctly imposed on the striate cortex, even seeing the little interruptions in the lines that constitute the visual pattern. So back to the model of Lee and Mumford. And what we want to take this model, assume that the x's, the outside observation, the x's corresponding to visual area 1, visual area 2, etc., correspond to random variables. The ones lower on, we have a fairly good idea of what they might correspond to. In particular, they allow you to detect lines. At somewhat higher levels, they compose lines to get sort of longer lines. And if, for example, you were looking at drawings or at cursive text, the higher levels would compose those lines into more complicated lines or lines with angles in them or cursives or portions of written text. The model that was discussed in the Lee and Mumford paper was relatively abstract, and it was primarily used as a basis for explaining various data from performing operations on humans when they're being operated on, and there is a medical reason in order to probe, but also, of course, in monkeys, which are the primary method for looking at cortical behavior. So the basic idea that in some sense the cortex is a generative model, that it can be described as a graphical model or a Markov random field, is fine, but if you're talking about a graphical model that is on the order of the size of the cortex, you're talking about millions and millions of variables and a very large number of connections. So what kind of learning algorithms would suffice for that kind of a model? There's been a lot of work on artificial neural networks in the past, and so many of the ideas that you're going to see in the following have their roots in earlier work, but in some sense they've found a clear instantiation in the form of graphical models for the reasons that I mentioned before, that the graphical models have the gold standard of having a clear and concise semantics in terms of a joint distribution over all the random variables. So I'm going to give you a concrete example. And the example is we're going to build a generative model to recognize digits. And so in this case, the digits come from a database that's comprised of some 500 people, with each of them writing a few hundred different instances of their digits 0 through 9. And the images were compiled by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology for the purpose of having a competition so that they could find a vendor or a company to provide the pattern recognition software that the post office uses to recognize zip codes. So these are essentially, they're simplified in the following sense, that the digits are centered in 28 by 28 images. They all have 8-bit depth, and they are scanned in sort of the standard way. Oh, and they're also light and dark adjusted, so that basically the luminance is the same overall. The brain does an extraordinary job in dealing with variation in luminance. If you can just imagine the problem of being inside your kitchen where it's relatively dark, reading a newspaper, walking outside, and continuing the whole time to follow the story that you're reading, that's an extraordinary feat with several orders of magnitude change in the overall luminance. So we're finessing some problems that are obviously hard, but there's still plenty of problems left to be had. So what we're going to do is we're going to build the same kind of generative model that we saw for our cartoon of recognizing buildings, distinguishing garages from houses. And the model is at the bottom, essentially, going to have enough random variables to cover the image. So the image is 28 by 28. That's 784. So at the bottom level of this cortical model, we have 784 random variables. As I mentioned in the cartoon, the idea of generative models is that they're compositional. So the features at one level are composed into sort of meta features at the next level. And at the very least, unless you learn the structure, which we're not going to do right now, you have to define how the features at one level map to the features at the next level. And so what we're going to do is we're going to divide up the 28 by 28 images into 4 by 4 regions. That constitutes 7 by 7, 4 by 4 regions. And I did that relatively arbitrarily the first time. The model that results is the one that you're seeing here. We also can define whether or not the receptive fields at one level overlap with one another or not. And in this case, we're going to indicate that at the lowest level that the receptive fields don't overlap, that they are, that they cover, they basically partition the image into these 49 regions. But at the next level, they do share information. And the reason that we want them to share information at various levels is that we think that there are correlations between portions of the image at one level or portions of the image in one region and the adjoining regions. And as you go higher and higher, those kinds of dependencies between adjoining visual fields allow you to encompass a concept that encompasses the whole image, in this case, the designation of a digit. So the software that we've developed allows us to specify what's generally called a pyramid graph Bayes-net for obvious reasons. You specify the number of levels, the way that the receptive fields at one level map onto the receptive fields at the next level. They're not always purely pyramidal. They can be truncated pyramids, essentially, because it's not the case that you always want a single feature at the top. In this case, we do. The top level feature is going to correspond to the classification of whether we're looking at a 0 or 9 or a 5 or a 4 or a 3. So the one on the left, you can see it has no dependence. It has the receptive fields at the bottom level overlap 1, but it has no intra-level connections, whereas the one on the right is exactly the same as the one on the left, except it has intra-level connections. And there's a lot of subtleties about the use of those inter-level connections and the degree to which they help in the recognition process. Now, typically, when you learn a graphical model, you use an algorithm called expectation maximization, in which you essentially start with an assignment to all of the parameters of the model. Remember, when I showed you the cartoon initially, I told you that I specified the parameters. In this case, we don't know, we're assuming we don't know anything about the concept, and so we want our the corresponding cortical model to learn about the features of the phenomena that's looking at, namely the writing of digits, and we want to compose those automatically, so we have to learn those parameters. And in EM, essentially, you set all the parameters initially random, and you perform a form of gradient ascent or descent in order to adjust those parameters to get them closer to a local maxima rather than a global maxima, and often that's quite good enough. But when we're talking about models that have millions of variables, that turns out to be very difficult indeed. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to learn the features from the bottom up. And in fact, there's a lot of developmental studies that indicate that that's exactly what humans and animals in general do. They learn those features, and those features go through, basically follow you for the rest of your life. There are great examples of extraordinary cruelty in which they've taken cats and they've put them in rooms in which there's only horizontal lines. And they've raised them for 3 or 4 weeks, and then they've exposed them to environments in which there are things other than horizontal lines. They cannot see the vertical lines. And they cannot learn them either. So there are certain levels of our visual processing that once you have one opportunity, essentially, to learn them. So you've heard lots of things about the plasticity of the brain, but there's also some areas in which it has great difficulty sort of going back and filling in the details after the opportunity has been lost, or for one reason or another, you've had some sort of a lesion and you've lost that ability. So at the bottom level, remember I said that these are 28 by 28 images. They have 8-bit depth. As far as I'm concerned, 256 values, that's a continuum. So I'm going to model them as though they're continuous variables. And I do something called a mixture of Gaussians, which you really don't have to understand how this is meant as an audience for, as a general audience. But I'll give you sort of a graphical depiction of what we're learning in this case. So remember, at the bottom level, each of the nodes takes in a 4x4 or 16 different pixels, each one of them being 4-bit depth. And here's an example of the kind of features that the mixture of Gaussians learns. So up in the upper left-hand corner, you see the 16 pixels. And this is after learning, after we've basically shown the cortical, the lowest portion of the cortical model, thousands and thousands of digits. And what I've done here is, in order to depict sort of what's going on in the learning model, is for each, I've set, pretty much arbitrarily, I've said that the random variable can take on 12 values. The random variable at that level. The level below it, there are, again, a vector of 16 real values, but we know they're 0 to 255. So what I then did was, in the same way that I mentioned that I could take a generative model, I could fix the value at the top, and then I could sample it. I've done the exact same thing at the bottom level, as though I could probe into the cortex and get some idea of the readings that follow. And so what I did was I sampled it 100 times. I probed it 100 times and got 100 samples, having fixed it at one of its levels. And what you see on the left is the summary of those 100 examples, where I've stretched out the 16 pixels from left to right. And then for each of the possible values the 12 values that it can take on, I've shown 2 little graphs. One is the one where I've stretched it out and shown all 100 values. And the little box next to it, what I've done for that, I've taken the average of all 100 samples. And then I've just depicted it as the little piece of the visual field with the third dimension coming out into the screen corresponding to the average of the intensity for all those values. So what do those look like? What's it learning? It appears to be learning to recognize bars in various orientations. It's distinguishing between those. So the one in the upper left-hand corner, that's a vertical bar. Same for the one below it. Let's see, if you go to the one such as this, you see it's a 45-degree angle, and you're getting some idea of what the system is able to pick up by looking at these various images. So the way that learning proceeds is it starts at the bottom of this hierarchy, and just as I showed for the cartoon at the outset, in order to quantify the entire model, you have to have the conditional probability for every variable given its parents. So essentially, you have to learn that. So the way that the algorithm works is, having learned the bottom level, it then uses that in order to generate samples for the level above it. And those samples then are used in order to set the variables and then perform EM in a little local circumscribed area to learn the parameters just for that portion of the image. So at the very lowest level, we're learning to distinguish various horizontal, vertical, etc. bars. At the next level, it composes those in terms of lines. At the level above that, they correspond to little portions of cursives in the written text. The models themselves, I said for the lowest level, they correspond to mixtures of Gaussians. The ones above that, there are a variety of things I've tried. The simplest and sort of most straightforward is just to represent them as a table, essentially you can think of it as a truth function. That has a lot of parameters, but in fact, the number of parameters doesn't seem to cause any problem having to do with overfitting, for those of you who know anything about machine learning. So what you would see is, if you sort of watch this over time, is that information would come in from the bottom. It would initially be fed into the nodes at the lowest level. It would learn the conditional probabilities for those lowest nodes. And then once those parameters were learned, it would then, the next time that data comes in, it would be sampled and propagated up further in the network, and it would work its way up through the network in that fashion. So I don't even know if this works. So here you see that the data is coming at the bottom level. The ones above it haven't been trained. It's looking at images. The images get fixed at the bottom. And it's learning this in a completely unsupervised manner. Then later on, what I do is I use it in a supervised manner at the by fixing the node at the very top, corresponding to the digit 0 through 9, for every image that it gets during the training process. And then later, in testing, basically, obviously, I don't fix the top node. I simply use that as the most likely output from the top node as the indicator of the guess for the model. So that's the way the basic learning algorithm works. However, if you did what I said and you tried to learn it node by node, you'd end up with a model that was not able to generalize or to move, basically to capture features that spanned reasonable portions of the image. So in order to facilitate doing exactly that, and also to create a level of granularity for parallelism that was suited to the kinds of cluster machines that we have most available, what I did was the following. For every node in a given level, I took that node's parents in the level above and the set of children for all of its parents. And I took that as a unit, which I refer to as a subnet. I constructed the subnets for every node, and then I composed them in cases where one subnet was completely contained in the other using an algorithm called maximal sets. That results, for the graph shown here, in 7 subnets. And the subnets themselves constitute a graph. And all of the learning and inference is performed on the graph as it's shown here. This results in a much more robust set of features that are learned by the overall cortical model, and it provides the basis for both learning and inference, where the information that's passed back and forth between subnets corresponds to marginal distributions that are computed by each of the subnets locally. Just to sort of pop up a level and to describe the way that the subnets are composed into larger structures, take this as a simple graph, show the red graph in the lower left-hand corner. That would correspond to one subnet. And in the cartoons in the following, the little triangles correspond to subnets and the circles to nodes. Each of the subnets then is a unit that consists of anywhere from 20 to 100 nodes. And remember, these are also in 3 dimensions. And each of them is a process running on a machine where the output of that process corresponds to samples that it generates to send upwards into the hierarchy to use for training the subnets higher in the hierarchy, or passing down priors or distributions in order to perform inference. There are 3 different algorithms that we've been looking at, and one new one that I've been working on just from reading a few of the papers here at Google on the MapReduce framework that you all have. So the easiest one is pointer chasing, and that's sort of the obvious kind of graph algorithms that you might expect. We're also using something called MPI, or the message passing interface framework. That's probably the predominant method for doing parallel computation on clusters today. And we have another new algorithm that uses a framework called publish and subscribe. If you think of the pyramid structures and the columnar structure that I began with sort of interposed over it, you can see it's fairly obvious how to partition the nodes or the subnets so as to allow for parallelism. In a given level, all of the nodes or all the subnets can compute simultaneously. And the processing in the next level essentially can wait until all of the inference at that level has been completed. Actually, the inference moves up and down the hierarchy, but again, for the most part, things can be done in that fashion. So again, back to the same sort of toy problem we've been looking at all along. You start off with the structure of the pyramid graph. From that, and this is a slice through the middle of the pyramid graph. From that, you construct the structure of the subnets, and then you can embed the subnets in a plane in order to allocate the processes in such a way to minimize communication. I'm not going to go through the publish and subscribe. I'll simply show this very briefly. That same structure of basically bulk parallel computation, where you divide up the overall computation in a level and distribute it among a bunch of processes, that fits exactly into the way that MapReduce works. Even though we allow for a slightly higher degree of asynchrony in the case of the MPI algorithms, the MapReduce one is essentially the same algorithm, with a lot of mystery, of course, good mystery from the programmer's perspective, about what goes on behind the scenes with all the inter-process communication. So the map portion is allowing each of the subnets to perform their computation, which essentially is to run an inference algorithm. And the reduce essentially combines the outputs of those and then maps them into the subnets at the next level. And so inference can proceed through a number of different MapReduce operations, moving up the hierarchy, down the hierarchy, and then up the hierarchy one more time. one of the keys and one of the reasons why I think that Google is probably going to be interested ultimately in getting systems that can behave like the Cortex in their ability to do pattern recognition is the ability to handle spatiotemporal features. And I'm not going to go into the details. This is a whole talk in and of itself. But cortical models that's what they are. They're machines for doing pattern recognition on time series. They deal with sequences and streams of data. That's what they're designed for. They extract or they exploit the opportunities of the contiguity of the data in time series in order to perform most of their inferences. It's that continuity that essentially provides them with most of their leverage. So some of the algorithms that we've developed handle spatiotemporal receptive fields. And the model that we're working on is very closely aligned with a model that Yoram Singer helped to develop back in the late 90s called Hierarchical Hidden Markov Models. In other talks, I will go into that in more detail, hopefully when Yoram is back from being away for a couple of days. So that's it for the talk, and I'd be glad to answer some questions.
So clustering into subnets, you said it's better. Is that from a theoretical perspective, from empirical? What did you mean by that?
That's purely empirical. There's no reason why you couldn't do that. In some sense, if the brain realizes that, sorry for the anthropomorphizing, that in a graph, a large tree, there may be a great distance between 2 points on a given level. And so the fastest way to get from one point to another is to go up the hierarchy, which is relatively shallow, and then back down the hierarchy. And unless you have some way at the local level of agglomerating portions of the data, then you can't get the kind of connectivity that you need in a tree. I mean, you have to have some branching factor. So with no branching factor at all, which is what you'd do if you just used a simple node and its parents, it's branching up, but it's not branching back down, and you need branching both ways. The subnet structure, where you take its parents and all their children again, satisfies that requirement. And larger ones are better, of course, but the larger they get, the more computationally complex they get as well. Okay, thank you.